Hi everyone, welcome back for video number 2. This video is going to cover the end of the 1970s. So let me share my screen for you. We can jump right in. This video is going to be a little longer. I'm hoping to keep it to around 10 to 12 minutes max. Minimize myself. And there we go. We are starting with Arthur Ashe becoming the first African-American man to win Wimbledon in July of 1975. He is the only Black man to have ever won singles titles at Wimbledon and the US Open and the Australian Open. He was also the first African-American man to be inducted into the Tennis Hall of Fame, which you can put on your bucket lists for things to do when you can leave your house again, because the Tennis Hall of Fame is just over the border in Rhode Island, and you can go and see the tributes to Arthur Ashe there. And in August of 1975, we see a further relaxation of Cold War tensions with the signing of the Helsinki Accords. They were a series of agreements that were signed in August of 1975 during détente by leaders of the United States, the USSR, and 35 other nations who were members of either NATO or the Warsaw Pact. The agreements focused on three main issues: cooperation, security, and human rights. They were a huge step forward in relaxing those tensions further. Then on July 4th, 1976, the United States of America celebrated its Bicentennial Celebration. It was in memory of the American Revolution. So it actually began the celebration in April of 1975 and then ended on July 4th, 1976. Huge celebration for America's 200th birthday. Later on in July of 1976, we see the second deadliest earthquake in history occur. It occurred in Tangshan, China, killed approximately 700,000 people. So if you look here in this middle bottom map, you can see where it hit. That's the red dot in the very center, and then the effects of it, these outer rings, it affected that very large area. So you can see a little bit closer on this map here, this entire area was fairly deeply affected. And these are images from the devastation and then an image of the memorial. In September 1976, on September 9th, Mao Zedong died, and he died only 9 months after the death of the other most important Chinese leader of the time, Zhou Enlai, who had died on January 8th of 1976. Mao Zedong had a series of heart attacks, and he died at the age of 82. He was a very controversial man. His politics, his beliefs in communism, his work to create China as we know it today is very controversial, but he is seen as one of the most important and most influential people in modern history. The next year, in September of 1977, the Camp David Accords were signed. So we end the Yom Kippur War, and we go quite a few years, 4 years in fact, before we see any attempt for peace between Israel and Egypt occur again. So prior to the Camp David Accords, Egypt decided to try for peace one more time. And they worked with the United States in order to try to gain that peace. The United States president at the time was Jimmy Carter, and he brought Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat from Egypt to Camp David. Camp David is a presidential retreat not too far from the White House. It's in Virginia, and it carries that full weight of the White House behind it, but in a little bit more of a less formal setting than meeting within the White House. The Accords were signed on September 17th, 1977. That's the United States Constitution Day, in case you forgot that. And in the Camp David Accords, we see Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, return to Egypt, becomes Egypt's property again. And the Israelis and the Israeli people and government were allowed access to the Suez Canal again. With this, we see Egypt recognize Israel as a country for the very first time. Excuse me, and as such, this becomes the first major agreement between Israel and an Arab nation. The Camp David Accords are arguably the most important agreements between Israel and any other country, and arguably one of the most important steps, if not the most important step, to obtaining peace in the Middle East. Then, in December of 1978, we see meetings occur and an agreement signed to reopen United States and Chinese diplomatic relations. So agreement is signed in December of 1978 and then officially are resumed in January of 1979. Cold War tensions at this point are even more relaxed, and we had seen that start with détente with Nixon, and Carter continues that stance of relaxing the tensions of the Cold War. Then in March of 1979, we see the most significant accident in United States commercial nuclear power plant history occur, and a major nuclear accident occurs in Pennsylvania on 3 Mile Island. The cleanup cost about $1 billion, and very fortunately, despite the very large and aggressive accident that occurred, there were no human deaths from it, and the health effects that have been seen since then have been quite low. So while you see this headline here on the right saying that Western officials feared a high death toll, because they did, we were very lucky that there were no deaths, but the cleanup was massive. Again, cost about $1 billion. Then, video for you. We're going to skip over this video for now, but you can check it out, learn a little bit more about the accident if you want on YouTube as well. Then in May 1979, on May 4th, 1979, Margaret Thatcher became the first female Prime Minister of England. She stays the Prime Minister from 1979 to 1990, and she is generally a popular Prime Minister. This here on the left is a picture of Prime Minister Thatcher, and on the right, this is 10 Downing Street, which is where the Prime Minister lives and works in England. So akin to our White House here, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, 10 Downing Street is the equivalent to that in England. Then in July of 1979, the Sony Walkman was first introduced. You could put a cassette tape into the Walkman and take your music with you. This is also considered the peak of disco mania in the United States. Then in November of 1979, we see the Iranian Hostage Crisis occur. The Iranian-Islamic Revolution had been going on. It started in January of 1978. It is during the Iranian-Islamic Revolution that we see a change in power. The Shah is forced out of Iran, and when the Shah comes to the United States to gain some medical attention, the Iranian people who are staging this revolution are not happy with the United States for doing that. The United States refuses to send him back just to be killed and agrees to give him the medical attention he is seeking. And as such, 52 American diplomats and citizens were taken hostage from the American embassy in Tehran, Iran, and were held for 444 days, from November 4th, 1979 until January 20th, 1981, in response to that US behavior during and after the Iranian-Islamic Revolution. Your work today is going to focus a little bit more on the Iranian hostage crisis. So you'll learn a little bit more about it. Very important event in history. You'll go a little bit more in depth into it. And finally, on November 20th, 1979, the Grand Mosque seizure occurred. This was where Islamist extremists took over the Al-Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. That is the holiest site in Islam in Saudi Arabia, so in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And in 10 days, these extremists killed hundreds of militants, security forces, and hostages that they had taken. In response, the royal family in Saudi Arabia, the Al Saud family, they enforced a much stricter observance of traditional religious and social norms. And we start to see this shift in policy in Saudi Arabia. Like I said, your work here with this video is going to focus on the Iranian hostage crisis. You're going to be doing a web quest, going to a website and answering questions as you move through that website. Please let me know if you have any questions.